In the early days of Operation Barbarossa, one image puzzled the German troops on the Eastern Front: Soviet women wielding weapons in trenches, bunkers, and defensive positions. It was no exception. It was state policy. Unlike the Nazi model, which confined women to the home and motherhood, the USSR had integrated hundreds of thousands into its military machinery. Female pilots, snipers, sappers, and tank operators challenged not only the enemy, but an entire ideological conception of the female role in war. And as combatants, they were also captured. How did the German army treat the Soviet women who were taken prisoner? Why were many not considered legitimate soldiers? And what role did their condition as women play in all this? Women on the front, the enemy the Wehrmacht did not expect. The dawn of June 22, 1941, brought more than the roar of 3 million German soldiers crossing the Soviet border. It brought a discovery that would shake the deepest convictions of the Wehrmacht. In enemy trenches behind Mosin-Nagant rifles, there were women. For German commanders, educated in the Prussian tradition where women stayed at home while men went to war, the presence of snipers, artillery women, and machine gun operators in the Red Army was incomprehensible. It was not just a tactical difference. It was a civilizational fracture. The first reports came from Army Group Center during the first 48 hours of the invasion. Reconnaissance units reported fierce resistance in villages where defenses were commanded by uniformed women. In Grodno, an anti-aircraft battery entirely manned by Soviet women held off the 4th Panzer Division for hours. The Germans did not know how to process this reality. The Soviet Union had systematically built this female military capacity. Since 1936, the new Soviet constitution proclaimed absolute equality between men and women, including the right and duty to defend the homeland. During the Winter War against Finland, thousands of women had already served as combat medics, radio operators, and snipers. The Soviet state saw no contradiction in training a woman to kill enemies of socialism. This military philosophy radically contrasted with National Socialist doctrine. In the Reich, the ideal woman was defined by 3 words: Kinder, Küche, Kirche, children, kitchen, church. Nazi propaganda celebrated mothers who bore children for the Reich, not those who bore arms. Although the war forced thousands of German women to work in armament factories, none were sent to the front. The very idea was anathema. The Third Reich's military structure did not provide any path for women to access combat roles. The only context in which the Nazi state granted institutional authority to women was in concentration camps. There, as Aufseherinnen, the female guards of the camp system applied punishments, supervised female prisoners, and maintained internal order. However, even they had clear limitations. They received no military training, were not considered part of the regular army, and, except in rare cases, were not allowed to carry firearms. Their role derived from the repressive apparatus, not from war doctrine. Unlike the Red Army, where the woman was a combatant, for the Nazis a woman with power was only acceptable if she operated within the closed space of a camp far from the front. When German officers encountered this reality on Soviet territory, the reaction was visceral. In the personal diaries of Lieutenant Colonel Hermann Balck, commander of the 1st Panzer Division, there are repeated references to his disgust at women who betrayed their nature by wielding weapons. For Balck and his contemporaries, these women were not enemy soldiers, they were aberrations. The numbers amplified the shock. Between 1941 and 1945, over 800,000 women served in the Soviet armed forces. These were not symbolic exceptions. Nearly 200,000 participated directly in combat. Soviet snipers like Lyudmila Pavlichenko, with 309 confirmed kills, demonstrated lethality that defied all German stereotypes about female inferiority in war. The nocturnal bombing regiments, crewed exclusively by women, sowed terror in German lines. Reich soldiers nicknamed them Nachthexen, the Night Witches. These pilots flew outdated biplanes, cut their engines near targets, and glided silently to drop bombs. The sound they made resembled brooms slicing through the air. For the Germans, it was as if Soviet women had summoned supernatural forces. The effectiveness of these female fighters intensified German discomfort. Their presence could not be dismissed as communist propaganda when German casualties mounted from enemy fire directed by women. The resistance in cities like Stalingrad and Leningrad depended to a significant extent on women operating heavy weapons, laying mines, and commanding mixed units. This operational reality clashed head-on with the Nazi worldview. If German women represented racial purity and sacred motherhood, the armed Soviet women embodied everything opposite: communist degeneration, perversion of natural roles, threat to male order. They were not enemies in the traditional military sense. They were living symbols of what National Socialism had come to destroy. German intelligence bulletins began recording a disturbing pattern. Captured women did not surrender easily. Many preferred suicide over capture. Others fought to the last bullet. Their ideological fanaticism seemed to exceed even that of male political commissars. For the Germans, this confirmed that Bolshevism had corrupted even the female essence. German internal propaganda responded quickly. Military publications began referring to these women as Flintenweiber, a derogatory term combining Flinte, rifle, with Weiber, a vulgar word for women. They were not soldiers, they were aberrations who had betrayed their gender. This ideological categorization would have lethal consequences. By denying them the status of legitimate combatants, the German military apparatus prepared to treat them entirely differently from male prisoners of war. Women with rifles did not deserve the protections of the Geneva Convention. They deserved to be eliminated as a symbol of everything rotten in the communist system. The cultural clash of June 22, 1941, was not merely military. It was the moment when two incompatible worldviews on gender, on war, on civilization collided on the battlefields of the Eastern Front. One would see female fighters as heroines of anti-fascist resistance. The other would turn them into top priority targets for extermination. Flintenweiber, the order to exterminate Soviet female fighters. On June 29, 1941, Marshal Günther von Kluge drafted an order that would seal the fate of thousands. Women in uniform must be shot. This instruction, issued from the Fourth Army, was not an improvised response to the chaos of the front, but a decision that institutionalized the summary elimination of Soviet female fighters. From the early days of Operation Barbarossa, German officers reported capturing women among enemy forces. These prisoners, dressed in military uniform and equipment, did not receive the treatment stipulated by the laws of war. The General Staff of Army Group Center classified their executions as part of cleansing operations, deliberately using vague language to avoid the designation of prisoners of war. In July 1941, the 122nd Infantry Regiment documented the execution of 30 female fighters near Vitebsk. No trial, no formal interrogation was held. Evidence of military participation sufficed. The word uniform became synonymous with condemnation. General Ernst Hammer, leading the 75th Infantry Division, expanded the policy in his internal directives. Russian women in uniform will be shot on principle. This formulation removed any distinction between combat roles, medical functions, rank, or age. Wearing a Soviet uniform was an intolerable transgression. Panzer commands acted more harshly. A report from the 4th Panzer Group documents a verbal order from an officer instructing his battalion not to take women prisoners. The exact phrase was recorded: "The Flintenweiber and other dangerous elements don't go to the POW camp. They go to the nearest tree." This direct and brutal language set the operational tone in sectors under their control. On October 10, 1941, Marshal Walter von Reichenau issued the so-called Severity Order, requiring all units to show ruthless harshness against political commissars, partisans, and irregular elements. Although it did not explicitly mention women, Soviet female fighters were already being treated as such. Divisions operating in Ukraine and Belarus applied this order to any woman captured with a military appearance. Among documented cases stands out that of the 34th Infantry Regiment, which executed a Soviet radio operator in Polotsk. According to the report, she was forced to dig her own grave and then shot in front of local civilians. No combat evidence was presented. She only carried a portable transmitter and a coded notebook. From August onward, summary executions began to appear in official war reports. In the sector of Army Group North, the commander of the 217th Regiment recorded the elimination of 4 female Bolshevik elements without further detail. The normalization of the term element evidenced the dehumanization applied to these women. Simultaneously, the Einsatzgruppen, Special units that followed the regular army received specific instructions. Einsatzgruppe B reported having processed 847 women in Belarus between September and November. Records indicate that many were classified as suspected of armed collaboration or contact with partisan groups. None received formal process. In these reports, the term Flintenweiber began to appear frequently. It was a compound word, women with rifles, used derogatorily. In internal documents, it replaced expressions like snipers or female soldiers. Using the term allowed details to be omitted and reduced any tactical complexity to a purely ideological category. Reich propaganda reinforced this narrative. In August, Das Schwarze Korps, the official organ of the SS, published an editorial titled "Against Stalin's Rats," which stated these armed women are not mothers, they are not wives, they are degenerate tools of Bolshevism. Their elimination was justified as an act of moral and racial hygiene. The internal manual Feindbild Ost, distributed by the Wehrmacht to frontline units, included sections dedicated to identifying dangerous enemies. Under the category of female irregulars, it recommended acting with maximum caution and determination. A final paragraph clarified, these women must not be treated as conventional prisoners. Their ideological fanaticism exceeds that of the commissars. What differentiated this policy from other wartime practices was its systematization. Some divisions began to record the executions of women as part of their operational statistics. The 198th Infantry Regiment, for example, included in its November monthly report a table with 3 columns: battles won, enemy material destroyed, and female elements neutralized. The executions were not limited to women in direct combat roles. Soviet nurses, despite being protected by the Geneva Convention, were frequently executed. The argument used was their logistical collaboration with Bolshevik terrorism. On the Smolensk front, the 8th Reconnaissance Battalion received verbal authorization to shoot 3 nurses captured alongside a destroyed unit. Some units developed simplified procedures. One example was the protocol adopted by the 137th Infantry Division: uniform inspection, weapon search, verbal interrogation no longer than 10 minutes, and immediate decision. In the margins of the document, an officer noted, "No time for long interrogations. If they wear military boots, they're combatants." In the rear, the processing of female prisoners was also influenced by these guidelines. At the Dulag 184 transit camp near Mogilev, a specific category was established for captured women. Records show that no woman with registered military training was transferred to POW camps. Most were executed or disappeared without a trace. The impact of these actions was known to the High Command. At an Army Group Center meeting in November 1941, the management of female Bolshevik elements was briefly discussed. General Hans von Salmuth stated that immediate elimination reduces the risk of enemy propaganda and local resistance. No one objected. Prisoner of the Reich, the fate reserved for Soviet female soldiers. Not all Soviet women in uniform were executed immediately. In some sectors of the Eastern Front, Wehrmacht units, the Abwehr or the Einsatzgruppen, decided to capture and temporarily detain female fighters. It was not out of clemency, it was out of tactical interest. In areas suspected of intense partisan activity or clandestine networks, prisoners were sent to military interrogation centers to extract information about Red Army movements, radio codes, or artillery positions. Most would not survive the process. The Abwehr, German military intelligence service, established specific centers for this purpose in occupied cities such as Smolensk, Mogilev, and Gomel. These locations were set up in requisitioned administrative buildings with detention rooms, isolation cells, and interrogation equipment. Internal reports indicate that between July and December 1941, at least 1,300 Soviet women were processed at these locations. Colonel Reinhard Gehlen, head of intelligence for Army Group Center, implemented a standardized form system for the interrogation of female fighters. The fields included basic data, name, unit, role, but also ideological categories such as degree of Bolshevik indoctrination and level of masculinization of behavior. The latter box reflected a Nazi obsession with the inversion of traditional gender roles. The methods applied combined psychological pressure, threats, and controlled physical torture. Abwehr manuals recommended alternating young male interrogators with older officers to generate emotional dissonance in the prisoner. In theory, severe physical harm was to be avoided in the first few days. In practice, many women were beaten, deprived of sleep, or subjected to stress positions. A document dated August 1941 details the results of 97 interrogations in Smolensk. In 58 cases, the prisoners did not cooperate and were classified as fanatical elements. These women were eliminated within the next 48 hours. In 19 cases, useful information about Soviet retreat routes was obtained. Only 5 were transferred to transit camps. The rest disappeared. The next stage of the process was operational classification. Once interrogation was complete, the prisoners were labeled according to ideological, not military, criteria. The Wehrmacht established an operational typology to classify captured Soviet female fighters, dividing them into 4 categories. Dangerous subversives, which included convinced fighters with advanced training, active partisans, women involved in armed actions in rural or urban areas, civilian collaborators, such as nurses, typists, or support personnel, and finally, unclassifiable elements, meaning prisoners without concrete evidence against them or apparent informative usefulness. The classification did not guarantee life. On the contrary, it served to decide the method of elimination. Subversives and partisans were usually executed in remote sites. Civilian collaborators were sent to transit camps as an intermediate step. The unclassifiable often disappeared during transport routes or died from neglect. Major Hans Krebs, liaison officer between the Wehrmacht and the SS in Minsk, designed a transfer procedure that standardized these routes. Transit camps such as Dulag 121 in Minsk or Dulag 184 in Vitebsk served as logistical funnels. Women remained there between 2 and 5 days before their final destination. Conditions in these camps were deliberately brutal. At Dulag 121, barracks meant for 50 people housed more than 200. Rations consisted of watery soup and moldy bread. There were no blankets nor medical attention. A report from the German Red Cross, sent in November 1941 and later archived, mentioned that the mortality rate is high and foreseeable. Transport to labor or extermination camps was carried out in unventilated cattle cars, with between 70 and 90 prisoners per unit. No food was provided during journeys lasting days. Captain Franz Stangl, logistics officer in the Gommel sector, calculated an acceptable operational loss of 10% en route. Women who died during the journey were thrown by the tracks without record. On the route to Ravensbrück, the Reich's main women's camp, cases were documented where more than 30% of the women died before arrival. Survivors were selected according to physical capacity. Those considered useless were eliminated within weeks for exhaustion or inefficiency. SS archives retain individual records of 217 Soviet female fighters sent to Ravensbrück between October 1941 and January 1942. Most noted their specialization: sniper, radio operator, sapper, and a subjective observation such as persistently hostile, potentially dangerous, or rehabilitation not viable. The admission procedure involved total head shaving, number assignment, and removal of all belongings. The Soviet uniform was destroyed in front of them. Some, according to testimonies from Polish prisoners, still had shrapnel in their bodies without having received medical attention. Dr. Fritz Klein, field doctor temporarily assigned to Ravensbrück, developed a classification table for prisoners according to level of ideological danger. The Soviets always appeared in the top 2 levels. This categorization determined their access or exclusion to work, food, or medical care. Not all captured women were sent to extermination or slave labor camps. In some cases, classification as a fanatical element led directly to covert executions. These were carried out in backyards of transit centers or even in military hospitals under the pretext of treatments. In October 1941, Military Field Hospital 162 in Borisov officially reported the death by sepsis of 8 Soviet women. In reality, according to marginal notes by Assistant Dr. Otto Berning, they were classified as irrecoverable fighters and executed via lethal morphine injections. In interrogations, sexual violence appeared as a complementary method. Although the official Wehrmacht doctrine prohibited it, several internal reports recorded its use in contexts of pressure. The November 1941 version of the Abwehr interrogation manual included a section titled Unconventional Coercive Techniques. Major Wilhelm Roeder, chief interrogator in Gomel, wrote in his monthly report, "In some cases, the threat of sexual humiliation facilitated confessions. In others, it was necessary to apply the act as a psychological catalyst. None of these cases resulted in disciplinary proceedings. In certain sectors, especially near Polesia and Bransk, mass disappearances of captured women were reported." A document from Einsatzgruppe C, dated December 17, 1941, mentions 146 female elements processed without formal record for logistical reasons. No further details are preserved. The deportation and classification of female fighters was not a deviation from the system, but an intermediate phase of the same extermination process. It was executed when the tactical value of the prisoner justified the brief postponement of her elimination. It was death delayed, not avoided. A few women survived this process either by chance, medical transfer, or intervention by officers interested in using them as specialized workers. But even these survivors were relocated under extreme surveillance, with no chance of integration. Administrative manuals of the camps indicate that Soviet prisoners with military backgrounds were not to be mixed with other nationals. Their influence on the rest was feared. They were segregated, observed, and used until they fell ill or their productivity declined. Then they disappeared. The medical records of transit camp Dulag 121 mention the case of a 22-year-old Soviet sapper transferred with serious injuries. She received basic treatment and was sent to Ravensbrück. Her entry number appears in the books. 2 weeks later, her number is crossed out. No cause, no note, just a red stroke. For many of these women, the journey never ended. They were transported from camp to camp without stability, as mobile resources destined for exhaustion. The system's logic was not custody. It was progressive, calculated extinction without a trace. Unlike men, who could be exchanged or used in major infrastructure projects, female fighters were not considered long-term useful assets. Ideological prejudice outweighed pragmatism. For the Reich, the armed woman had to be erased, not repurposed. Weapons against them, sexual violence as military punishment. The Barbarossa Decree, signed by Wilhelm Keitel on May 13, 1941, established a legal framework that transformed rape into an authorized military tool. This document exempted German soldiers from criminal responsibility for crimes against Soviet civilians, with the only exception being offenses that affected internal discipline or German racial purity. Sexual violence against Slavic women was not only left unpunished, it was implicitly authorized. Captured Soviet female fighters faced rape as a specific form of ideological punishment. Perpetrators justified these acts as correction of elements that had betrayed their feminine nature. Lieutenant Werner Mulders of the 7th Infantry Regiment wrote in his personal diary, "These Russian women need to be reminded of their true purpose before we eliminate them." Testimonies collected during post-war trials reveal systematic methods developed specifically for captured fighters. They were frequently raped in the presence of other prisoners as a form of collective humiliation. Perpetrators combined sexual violence with verbal degradation, forcing victims to admit that women were meant to serve, not to fight. In occupied territories, the Germans requisitioned buildings to establish military brothels where Soviet women, including captured fighters, were forced to serve as prostitutes. Major Heinrich Springer, responsible for welfare services for the 11th Infantry Division, meticulously documented the operation of these establishments in his region of Smolensk. Administrative records of these brothels, discovered in German archives decades later, show systematic categorization of women by age, physical appearance, and level of resistance to collaboration. Female fighters received a special classification as priority punishment material, indicating that their sexual exploitation was considered a form of retribution for having fought against Germany. Anna Komarova, sniper of the 25th Guards Rifle Division, survived 5 months in one of these establishments before being transferred to Ravensbrück. She later testified, "They forced me to serve up to 20 soldiers a day. When I resisted, they beat me until I lost consciousness. Then they kept using me while I was unconscious." German military medical reports provide statistical evidence of widespread sexual violence. Records from Army Group Center show rates of venereal diseases 30% higher than those recorded on the Western Front. Dr. Hans Munch, principal physician of the sector, attributed this phenomenon to frequent sexual contact with local female population, especially captured elements. Female fighters faced specific forms of violence designed as symbolic punishment. Testimonies document cases where snipers were raped with their own rifles before being executed. Others describe genital mutilation as correction of women who had forgotten their natural reproductive function. Sergeant Otto Kretschmer of the 3rd Reconnaissance Battalion documented in official reports the systematic rape of 6 captured women during anti-partisan operations near Bryansk. His report described them as female elements processed according to standard procedures for ideological correction prior to final elimination. German interrogators incorporated threats of sexual violence and their fulfillment as an authorized technique to break the resistance of captured fighters. Abwehr manuals included graduated sexual pressure as a method to extract information from fanatical prisoners. Major Rudolf Lange, interrogation specialist, reported 80% success using these methods. In some regions, the rape of female fighters became a public spectacle. Captain Franz Reichleitner organized collective rapes of captured women in the main square of Gomel, forcing the local population to witness the humiliation. These events served as a warning about the consequences of resisting German occupation. Paradoxically, the same system that authorized multiple rapes of Soviet women severely punished prolonged consensual relationships. Disciplinary records show soldiers executed for racial contamination after maintaining voluntary relations with Slavic women, while perpetrators of documented rapes faced no prosecution. Soldier Klaus Barbie was court-martialed and executed for maintaining a 6-month relationship with a Ukrainian forced laborer. The same tribunal completely ignored the accusations that he had systematically raped female fighters during cleansing operations. The system protected German racial purity, not the physical integrity of the victims. Women who survived multiple rapes faced additional trauma through forced pregnancies. Germans prohibited abortions for raped Soviet women, arguing that the resulting children would be racially inferior but useful as future labor. These pregnant women were sent to special camps where they gave birth under brutal conditions. Vera Malakova, commander of a sapper unit, became pregnant after repeated rapes during captivity in Minsk. She was transferred to a facility where she gave birth without medical assistance. Her child died 3 days later due to lack of basic care. Malakova testified, "They made me give birth like an animal only to let the baby die." It was pure cruelty. German troops developed specific tactics to capture fighters using deception, promising treatment as prisoners of war. Once captured, these women faced systematic rape before execution or deportation. Lieutenant Friedrich Hartjenstein specialized his unit in these operations, reporting high effectiveness in neutralizing hostile female elements. Some commanders attempted to limit rapes for logistical reasons, not humanitarian ones. They feared that massive pregnancies would complicate military operations or that venereal diseases would affect combat effectiveness. However, these attempts were minimal and lacked effective institutional support. Sexual violence against Soviet female fighters operated within a logic that fused misogyny, racism, and political ideology. Women were not raped simply for being women, but for being women who had transgressed the natural order by taking up arms against the Reich. Their punishment had to symbolically restore the gender hierarchy they had challenged through military participation. The methods developed against Soviet fighters established precedents that would later spread geographically. Similar techniques were later applied against resistant women in Yugoslavia, Greece, and Italy. Rape had evolved from an occasional war crime to a systematic component of German military strategy in occupied territories. Road to Ravensbrück, the final destination of captured female fighters. 90 kilometers north of Berlin, between lakes that cruelly reflected the German sky, stood Ravensbrück. This camp, unique in its design specifically for women, would become the final destination for thousands of Soviet female fighters who had survived capture, interrogation, and deportation. Their arrival did not mark the end of their suffering, but their transformation into human material for the Reich's projects. The trains that arrived at the Fürstenberg station unloaded women marked with German bureaucratic precision. Soviet female fighters entered the camp system identified by red triangles with the letters RU for Russland. This mark immediately made them priority targets for the brutality that characterized camp administration. Fritz Sören, commander of Ravensbrück since 1942, had perfected a classification system that divided Soviet prisoners according to their potential usefulness to the Reich. The physically capable were assigned to forced labor in the Siemens factory built inside the camp. Those selected by SS doctors entered the human experimentation program. Those deemed useless for either purpose quickly disappeared from the system. The intake process systematically eliminated any vestige of military identity. Women were stripped of uniforms, documents, and personal belongings. Their heads were completely shaved. They received tattooed numbers that replaced their names in all records. A sniper with hundreds of confirmed kills became Russian political prisoner number 47,832. Those assigned to forced labor faced workdays designed to exterminate gradually. In the Siemens factory, they produced electrical components for German armaments working 14 to 16 hours a day. Soviet female fighters, considered especially dangerous due to their military training, received the most grueling tasks, loading heavy materials, working in industrial furnaces, handling toxic chemicals without any protection. The diet had been scientifically calculated by German nutritionists to provide limited survival. 350 grams of black bread, watery soup with vegetable scraps, and occasionally rancid margarine provided enough calories to keep a prisoner alive for about 3 months under intense forced labor. It was extermination by exhaustion, measured with characteristic German precision. Dorothea Binz, chief supervisor of the female guards, had developed specific disciplinary methods for ex-combatants. Punishments included standing immobile for hours in any weather, working naked in winter, and confinement in the bunker, isolation cells where prisoners were locked in spaces so small they could neither lie down nor stand completely upright. Dr. Karl Gebhardt, personal physician to Heinrich Himmler, had chosen Ravensbrück as an ideal laboratory for human experimentation. Female fighters represented especially valuable material because their military training had given them greater physical endurance than the average civilian population. His experiments sought to develop efficient methods to weaken enemy populations. Prisoners selected for experimentation were transferred to Block 10, separated from the rest of the camp by additional barbed wire. There, Gebhardt and his assistants Fritz Fischer and Hertha Oberhäuser performed procedures without anesthesia to study pain resistance in inferior races. They amputated healthy limbs to observe healing processes. They injected lethal bacteria into open wounds to test the effectiveness of experimental drugs. Partially preserved medical records describe specific experiments on Soviet female fighters. A typical entry read, Subject 23R. Sniper, 24 years old, exceptional resistance to sulfonamides, induced infection in lower limb progressing as expected. Subject remains conscious after 72 hours without treatment. The entries continued until they simply stopped, indicating the death of the subject. Other procedures aimed to develop methods of mass sterilization to apply in occupied territories. Female fighters were subjected to radiation, chemical injections, and experimental surgeries designed to eliminate their reproductive capacity. Doctors justified these procedures as prevention of the spread of inferior Bolshevik genes. Medical brutality was combined with calculated psychological sadism. Female fighters selected for experimentation were forced to observe procedures performed on other prisoners before being operated on themselves. Doctors deliberately fed the terror, believing that extreme fear provided more valuable data on human endurance. Nina Popova, sniper of the 3rd Naval Brigade, survived 6 months of experimentation before being declared exhausted material. In later testimony, she described, "They cut off my left leg to see how it would heal. When it healed poorly, they cut off the right to compare. Then they injected things that made me vomit blood for days." General camp conditions deteriorated dramatically after 1943 when Ravensbrück became overcrowded with prisoners from all over occupied Europe. The Soviet female fighters, who had arrived in earlier waves, found themselves in positions of relative seniority, which some exploited to create survival hierarchies within the barracks. However, many ex-fighters used their military training to organize clandestine resistance. Valentina Safonova, former commander of an anti-tank unit, established communication networks between barracks that allowed coordination of minor sabotage in the factories. Her military discipline, forged in Eastern Front battles, provided psychological advantages to resist systematic dehumanization. Sabotage took subtle but effective forms. Combatants with technical experience introduced defects in electrical components, slowed production through coordinated accidents, and occasionally damaged costly machinery. The Germans responded with collective punishments, but never managed to eliminate this resistance completely. Mortality among Soviet female prisoners significantly exceeded that of other national groups. Administrative reports from Suren show that between 60% and 70% of the Soviet female fighters who entered died before the end of the war. Official causes ranged from infectious diseases to workplace accidents and escape attempts. Deaths were recorded as anonymous statistics. Monthly reports simply listed numbers. Russian casualties, February 1943, 127. March 1943, 203. There were no individual names, military histories, or notifications to families. Female fighters who had defended Stalingrad or Leningrad disappeared into bureaucratic numbers. During 1944, as Soviet forces approached German territory, Ravensbrück administration accelerated the elimination of prisoners considered especially dangerous. Soviet female fighters topped this list due to their potential as witnesses to German crimes and their propaganda value for the Red Army. Dr. Friedrich Menneker, SS psychiatrist, developed a specific euthanasia program for irrecoverable elements. He selected Soviet female fighters for lethal injections based on criteria combining declining labor usefulness with perceived ideological danger. His medical notes described these killings as final therapeutic treatment. A mobile gas chamber was brought to Ravensbrück in February 1945, specifically to accelerate the elimination of Soviet female prisoners. Operated by SS Unterscharführer Erich Musfeld, this facility processed groups of 50 to 70 women per session. The Germans justified these executions as preventive measures against vengeance elements. On April 30, 1945, advanced elements of the Red Army liberated Ravensbrück. They found approximately 2,000 prisoners in extreme starvation, many unable to walk or speak coherently. Among them, fewer than 50 were identifiable Soviet female fighters. Most had perished during years of forced labor, medical experimentation, and accelerated executions. The Soviet liberators meticulously documented camp conditions, photographed evidence of German crimes, and collected survivor testimonies. However, they paid no special attention to the surviving female fighters. In Stalinist logic, these women had failed by allowing themselves to be captured, and their suffering did not make them heroines but suspicious elements. Lyudmila Konovalova, sniper of the 62nd Division who survived Ravensbrück, later described the irony of her liberation. "I waited 3 years for our soldiers to arrive. When they finally came, they arrested me for being a prisoner of war. I had survived the Germans only to be punished by the Russians." For the few female fighters who survived Ravensbrück, liberation marked the beginning of a new phase of persecution. Their war was far from over. The system that had turned them into nameless numbers would now turn them into figures of a forced silence that would last for decades. The Erased Archive, the silenced story after their liberation. May 8, 1945 marked the official end of the war in Europe, but began a new phase of victimization for surviving Soviet female fighters. Their liberation from German camps confronted them with systematic suspicion from their own government, which saw in every returning prisoner a potential traitor who had survived through collaboration. Stalin's Order No. 270, signed on August 16, 1941, had automatically declared all Soviet soldiers who surrendered to the enemy as traitors. This provision did not consider circumstances of capture, gender, age, or conditions of captivity. For Stalinist paranoia, remaining alive in enemy hands constituted prima facie evidence of treason. Colonel Ivan Serov, NKVD chief for repatriation matters, had established a filtering system operating through special camps where former prisoners faced interrogations designed to detect collaboration. Female fighters received particularly intense scrutiny because their survival seemed especially suspicious to male interrogators. The filtering questionnaires preserved in FSB archives revealed the paranoid logic of the process. Questions focused not on the sufferings endured but on methods of survival. How had she obtained extra food? What information had she provided in exchange for medical treatment? Had she had sexual contact with Germans? Each answer was analyzed as evidence of potential betrayal. Klavdia Nechaeva, former sniper who survived 18 months in Ravensbrück, endured 6 months of interrogations in a Siberian filtering camp. Investigators became obsessed with explaining how she had survived while other prisoners died. Nechaeva was eventually released but never officially rehabilitated. Her military record remained marked as untrustworthy until her death in 1982. Silence became state policy. Soviet authorities categorically prohibited publications, memoirs, or testimonies about experiences in German camps. Any reference to captivity was automatically censored from official war histories. Surviving female fighters were explicitly instructed not to discuss their experiences with anyone. This policy had multiple objectives: protecting the narrative of unbreakable Soviet heroism, avoiding acknowledgement of the magnitude of German crimes the government had failed to prevent, and eliminating testimonies about military conditions that had facilitated mass captures. The Soviet state needed there to be no defeats, no captures, no compromising survival. Records related to prisoners of war were classified as top secret. Documents on filtering, lists of former prisoners, and testimonies about German experiences were deposited in special KGB archives, inaccessible even to official historians of the Communist Party. Simultaneously, West Germany developed its own form of historical denial. During the Cold War, the Federal Republic's authorities systematically minimized Wehrmacht crimes on the Eastern Front. The dominant narrative portrayed the German army as a professional institution that had fought honorably against Bolshevism. General Franz Halder, former German Chief of Staff, directed a historical review program during the 1950s that sanitized military archives. Documents evidencing orders against female fighters, reports on systematic rapes, and deportation records disappeared from official collections or were transferred to classified archives. War crimes trials avoided examining the specific treatment of Soviet female fighters. Allied tribunals focused on the Holocaust, general medical experiments, and crimes against civilians. The particular fate of female fighters was not addressed as a distinct victim category. The Ravensbrück trial, held in Hamburg between 1946 and 1948, exemplified these omissions. Although several SS doctors were convicted for experiments, no testimony focused on Soviet female fighters as a specifically victimized group. The Soviet survivors were not called to testify, officially due to diplomatic complications with Moscow authorities. British prosecutor Colonel T.M. Backhouse deliberately avoided testimonies that might highlight crimes against communists, fearing they would complicate Western relations with the new federal Germany, considered an essential ally in the emerging Cold War. Justice was subordinated to geopolitical convenience. This conspiracy of silence kept hidden for decades the history of captured Soviet female fighters. In the West, the narrative of a Wehrmacht that had fought cleanly in the East prevailed. In the USSR, these women simply did not exist in official versions of the war. The first academic studies on Nazi violence on the Eastern Front, published during the 1960s and 1970s, focused on the Jewish genocide, partisan repression, and the destruction of Slavic villages. Captured female fighters remained invisible, being an ambiguous category that did not fit into established analytical frameworks. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 began to open some archives, but the process has been extremely slow. The FSB, successor to the KGB, maintains restrictive control over documents related to prisoners of war. Many files remain classified under arguments of national security, even though the events occurred more than 70 years ago. German archives have released more material since reunification, but decades of sanitization during the Cold War eliminated crucial evidence. Contemporary researchers must reconstruct this history through fragmented documents, limited oral testimonies, and circumstantial evidence. The few survivors who remained alive during the 1990s faced additional obstacles to tell their stories. Decades of forced silence had eroded traumatic memories. Many had developed psychological mechanisms that included suppressing captivity memories. Others feared that speaking would affect their veteran pensions. Tatiana Baramzina, sniper who survived Ravensbrück and Soviet filtering, never spoke publicly about her experiences until an interview in 1998, 3 years before her death. She explained, "For 50 years, every time someone asked about the war, I said I had been sick in a hospital. It was easier than explaining the truth. The available numbers provide only approximate estimates of the tragedy. Between 20,000 and 30,000 Soviet female fighters were captured by German forces during the war. Less than 10% survived until liberation. Of these survivors, a significant number died during Soviet filtering or in Siberian labor camps. Those who survived both persecutions rarely spoke publicly. Their stories were lost with their deaths, taking with them irreplaceable testimonies of one of the most brutal aspects of the war on the Eastern Front. Administrative disappearance had triumphed completely. This invisibilization represents more than historiographic negligence. It constitutes a continued form of institutional violence that extends from the initial capture to the present. These fighters were victimized first by their German captors, then by their own government, and finally by decades of denial in both Cold War blocs. The result is a permanent absence in the historical record. Women who defended Stalingrad, operated behind enemy lines, and endured years of systematic torture have been reduced to footnotes in general histories of World War II. Their courage has been eclipsed by silence, their suffering denied by political convenience. When the last direct witnesses died during the first decade of the 21st century, fully reconstructing this history became impossible. Administrative disappearance had achieved its goal, erasing from collective memory thousands of stories of women who fought for their convictions, suffered for their gender, and were punished for their nationality. Their legacy resides not in official monuments, but in fragments of testimonies, partial documents, and the persistence of researchers who refuse to let this history remain buried forever. They are ghosts of classified archives, victims of a conspiracy of silence that outlived both the Third Reich and the Soviet Union, reminding us that the history written by the victors often omits those who paid the highest price for victory.